My name is Arlene Mednick, the Chair of Concerned Citizens here at Brooksby. As the Chair of Concerned Citizen, I am very proud to come out here and to greet you and bring to Brooksby some really wonderful speakers. Today, we have one that is outstanding. I am so proud to be part of this. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Remember, if you know of any speakers you want to hear, or if you know any speakers who would be of interest to us, just let me know or one of my board members, and we will see that we get that speaker or that we talk about the area of concern. In August, we will have Joanne Simon as our speaker. She is the head of Northeast Arc and has been featured in the Boston Globe as the #1 businesswoman of the year. She is also the daughter of the late Elaine Simon, who was a resident here at Brooksby and a very good bridge player. Yeah, with my other interests, yes. I met her while playing bridge, and then she told me one day that she was very proud of her daughter. Well, we're all proud of our daughters. And then she told me why. Well, I had to go meet her, and I was impressed. And having been I had the book from the Globe showing that she was the #1 businesswoman. And at that time, I invited her to be a speaker. It was just before shutdown for COVID. But she will be here in August. Okay, and in September, we are having the Massachusetts Coalition for the Prevention of Gun Violence, another light subject to talk about. And I'm very pleased. I understand that this organization is fabulous, and they're sending their best speaker to us. If there is a subject that you would like to hear or you want covered, Concerned Citizens is the place to do it. Tell me, tell one of my board members, and we'll get it done. I just want to remind you, please, right now, silence your phones. It's very disconcerting to have it to go. Just put it on airplane mode, make it easy. And for our Q&A, just wait till somebody just raise your hand and wait till somebody brings you the microphone. And now I'd like Ralph Mednick, I think you might know who he might be, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Arlene. Frank and Sarah Huntington moved to Brooksby Village 2 years, 2 months, and 0 days. But in that short time, he has been an asset to this community and an impact on all of us, or those who have attended his many lectures. Frank has educated us, has humored us, has entertained us, and Frank and Sarah, his wife, have inspired. Frank has given 3 live and learn lectures in this short span of time. First, American history and sessions. Then the 60s, a decade that changed America, and most recently, boom and bust, the roaring 20s and the Great Depression. And would you believe it, Frank is a jazz piano player for the Brooksby Irregulars. And to top it off, Frank was here a year ago, giving a concerned citizen presentation entitled "The Supreme Court versus Abortion. What are they thinking?" And most notably, Frank is the author of a 700-plus page treaty book entitled "Making It Up as You Go Along, stories the Supreme Court talk about the Constitution. I will make a shout out to Sarah, Frank's wife, because she's the one who came up with this interesting and provocative title. Frank Huntington has a PhD in history from Brown University and a JD from Harvard Law School. He was a trial attorney, including 20 years with the Securities and Exchange Commission. With that, give a hearty Brooksby welcome to Frank Huntington.
Wow, that was a really kind introduction. I've never thought of myself as an asset, but yes, why not? It just does seem a bit daunting, though, to have Ralph promise an entertaining talk when the subject is voter suppression in the country. So we'll see. I think he also said humorous, and I can't promise you many jokes either, but we'll do what we can. So, thanks to the concerned citizens for inviting me. My topic, is that a good sign or a bad sign? What's a good sign? Oh, great. I think some of us just got the text that they're turning off the power in Thorndike again tomorrow. So I thought maybe they were starting here. Good to know that's not true. All right. So I want to talk about the ways that states are making it harder for people to vote. And I have to confess that, will there be any lights left by the time I'm done? I'll need one so I can see my note. But anyway, all right, well, this is getting mysterious. So I have to confess that these days, I really find it hard to read the Globe or to watch CNN because basically I get too upset. There's too many things happening in the world that either get me angry or depressed. So when Ralph suggested I talk to you about voter suppression, my heart sank because I really wasn't sure I could prepare for this without sending my blood pressure up to dangerously high levels. But fortunately, as you can see, I have survived. Oh, hey, isn't that cool? Whoa, all right. This is high tech. Okay, so I want to talk to you about some of the things that are happening today. And because I am a historian, I can't help but want to give you some historical perspective on what's happening today. And actually, my historical perspective is really simple. Voter suppression is nothing new. Voter suppression has a long history in this country. And ever since this country was founded, some of the people with political power have tried to protect their power by making it harder and even impossible for other people to vote. It's kind of an American tradition. So let's start with just a quick, I apologize, history lesson. Thomas Jefferson, right? He wrote in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but he didn't mean it. He was fibbing. He did mean men. He wasn't thinking about women in the slightest. But he didn't mean all men because he certainly wasn't counting black men. And he wasn't even counting all white men because in the colonies, you had to have a certain amount of property or you couldn't vote. All right, so all men are created equal sounds great, but in his mind, it had a much narrower connotation. Now, get to those guys. So the Founding Fathers, there they are, great painting of them in the Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You can probably tell that, well, if you're close enough to see the screen at any event, you can probably tell that those are well-to-do white guys. And half of them were lawyers, which was probably a bad sign. And I hate to break it to you, but the Founding Fathers didn't trust ordinary people like us. And they believed America should be run by prosperous white men like themselves. And they were very afraid that men with little property or no property, all those farmers and shopkeepers and artisans, laborers around the country, They were afraid all those folks would get control of the political system. So, and the Founding Fathers had a word for what they were afraid of, and that word was democracy. You may be surprised to know that back in the Founding Fathers generation, democracy was not a good thing. Democracy meant mob rule, rule by the people who don't have much property and will just satisfy their own desires. And it's interesting, behind closed doors at the convention, our Founding Fathers were very blunt about how they felt about folks like us. Alexander Hamilton said that the voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. But that's not true. People are turbulent and changing, and they seldom judge or determine right. Roger Sherman from Connecticut said the people should have as little to do as possible with the government. That's not a good sign. John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice, those who own the country ought to govern it. And even George Washington, mankind left to themselves are unfit for their own government. So what did they do? Those guys went ahead and drafted a constitution that would make it tougher for ordinary people like us, and at the moment I'm only speaking about the white men with property in the room, but at least make it harder for anybody like that to push them out of their positions of power. So how did they do it? The way they set up the government was designed to keep us all in our place. Each congressional district was going to have 30,000 people, which was a lot of people at the time. James Madison said large districts would promote the election of men with a probable attachment to the rights of property. Most of the Founding Fathers wanted to limit the right to vote to people who own land. They couldn't come up with a uniform definition of that to apply across the country, so they decided that the states could pick who would get to vote for Congress. And every state except Pennsylvania had a property requirement for voting. Now, why do we have a Senate? The Senate is there to keep the House from getting out of control. As Madison put it, the Senate would protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The senators ought to come from and represent the wealth of the nation. So, to make sure that the Senate had the right kind of people, they let the state legislatures pick the senator. People didn't start electing senators until the early 20th century. And you can imagine, these guys certainly didn't want the president to be elected by a popular vote. George Mason, one of the Founding Fathers, and there's a college named for him in Virginia, said it would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a president to the people as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. Metaphor, but basically ordinary folks like us are blind as to what would be in the country's best interest. So, there's the Constitution. And my point, a couple of points here. It was designed to protect the political power of the nation's social and economic elite. The Constitution doesn't say anything about a right to vote. And what that means is that the question of who can vote was left up to the state. Now, things didn't quite stay that way, and there have been some amendments that have given certain people the right to vote. After the Civil War, Congress passed an amendment, and states ratified that states could not deny the vote based on race. In 1913, people finally got the chance to vote for U.S. senators directly. In 1920, women finally got the right. And in 1971, remember, they lowered the voting age to 18 on the theory if you're young enough, if you're old enough to be sent to Vietnam, you ought to be old enough to vote about whether that was a good idea. But except for those amendments, it is still the case that the states control who's going to vote and how the votes are going to be counted. So, from the moment the Constitution went into effect, people with political power have been trying to limit other people's voting One way One way I mentioned is the property requirement. When the country got started, 30% of white men didn't have enough property to vote. Okay, so you look around the room, that would be a third of the men can't vote. It wasn't until the 1830s that universal suffrage for white men became the rule. Now, let's get down to some serious talk about voter suppression. And actually, I mentioned to a friend of mine who was from the Deep South that I was going to be talking about voter suppression, and she said, well, the South invented that. And they didn't invent it, but they were really good at it. And so you had an amendment, constitutional amendment, that said every black man should be allowed to vote. But the states found all sorts of ways to get around it. Partly, they simply terrified black men to keep them away from the polls. But they also started changing the rules in a way that would make it hard for black men to vote, even though the 15th Amendment was still there. One of the tricks was a grandfather clause. Now, we use that phrase these days. It originally was quite a sinister thing. A grandfather clause was, you can only vote if your grandfather could vote in 1860. Okay? And it's safe to say that there wasn't a black man in the South who could say that about his grandfather. It was such an obvious ploy to get around the 15th Amendment that the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. But the southern states didn't really need grandfather clauses because they came up with other ways to keep people from voting. The poll tax, you had to pay for the privilege of voting. And it wasn't usually a large amount, but even a small amount would be enough to keep poor white men and poor black men from voting. It wasn't until 1964 that a constitutional amendment outlawed the poll tax. Or you could try a literacy test. At the end of the 19th century, half the black men in the South couldn't read. So a literacy test was pretty effective. And then if a black man walked in who actually could read, they would play games. Here's the state constitution. Read this paragraph and explain it. Oh, white guy walked in, that was not what they would give him to read. It was something pretty simple. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that got rid of literacy tests and the other tricks that the southern states were using. The Voting Rights Act worked. In 1964, 7% of blacks were registered to vote in Mississippi. 3 years later, after the Voting Rights Act, 60% were registered. A few years after that, 2/3 of the blacks in the South registered, and that was the same percentage as for white South. So registration equality really did come along. Okay, now, when the Constitution went into effect, the most sweeping form of voter suppression in the country was concerned women. Obviously, women were prevented from voting virtually everywhere in the country. They made a mistake in writing a new constitution for New Jersey, 1790s. For like a year, women got to vote because they forgot to put in the word male. And when they figured out the mistake, they changed it. So women couldn't vote. And the seed of change came in 1848 in a little town called Seneca Falls in upstate New York. 300 women and men attended a women's rights convention. And they declared that all men and women are created equal, and they demanded the right to vote. Newspapers were shocked. Fight took 70 years. 70 years. It wasn't until 1919 that Congress passed the 19th Amendment. Okay, so women and blacks are the largest groups of people who have been prevented from voting in this country, but there are others. There. Let's see who actually gets to go in. How about people who live in the state but aren't U.S. citizens? Congress has prohibited non-citizens from voting in federal elections. Virtually every state has a rule that prohibits non-citizens from voting. There are few states in which cities and towns have a choice. The only town of any size is Montpelier, Vermont. Both San Francisco and New York City tried it. Their state court said it was unconstitutional. So if you're a non-citizen, you're not voting. How about if you're a convicted felon? There are a lot of them. Every state except Maine and Vermont disqualifies a felon while they're in prison, in most states after they get out, quite a while. Okay, so I've been talking about ways in which whole categories of people have been prevented from voting. There's lots of other clever ways to discourage or control somebody else's vote. For years now, some states have been making it easier to get a mail-in ballot. The results in 2016 and 2020 showed that mail-in voters tend to vote Democrat. Maybe they're young and going to college. For whatever reason, the polling results are pretty clear on that. Since 2020, state legislatures in a number of states, all controlled by Republicans, have been trying to restrict mail-in voting. One way you do it is make the period for applying really, really short, so a lot of people are going to miss it. Or you can add an identification requirement. You can't just fill out one of those things. That works in Massachusetts. But in some states, you'd have to provide some proof of citizenship. All right, now, voter identification is one of the really hot topics in politics these days. And so what's the issue? Well, I used to live in Winchester, and I got to vote in, there it is, the McCall Middle School gym. So every voting day, I'd hit in there, and there'd be a couple of poll workers at a folding table, and they'd have just a list of the registered voters. I'd tell them who I was, name and address. They'd check off my name and give me a ballot. Now, most of the time, that poll worker had no idea who I was, right? Maybe it was the parent of somebody, a kid who went to school with my kids, but most of the time, anybody could have walked in there and pretended to be me. They would have had a respectable chance of getting a ballot. That's possible in Massachusetts because we are one of the minority of states that does not require voters to prove who they are when they're going to vote. Part of my research, this is sort of the state of play when it comes to voter identification. 17 states, they are the ones in yellow, require a photo ID, which is basically a driver's license or a passport, or some other photo ID issued by the government. There are very few exceptions to those photo requirements. A few states say if you have a religious objection to being photographed, then you're excused, but that doesn't apply to many people. Now, the states in green, there are 16 of them, they need some other type of evidence. Like, you walk in with your phone bill that shows your name and the address you claim to live at, and you have the bill, they'll say, all right, that must be Huntington. Or if you come, some states let you bring in a Medicare card. Or if the person at the poll recognizes you, in some states that's good enough. But the remaining 17 states, and they're all in gray, have no ID requirement. Well, that's a big issue, right? I mean, that's tricky. And voter suppression based on something like this is the hot topic across the country. And I looked at there. One site that I found said there are currently more than 150 bills pending in state legislatures in the country that are designed to make it harder for people to vote. And in some of those states, people have been taken to the street to protest. So 150 different proposals in 30 different states, that sounds kind of depressing, read it. But then I kept reading. There are also 275 pending bills in 35 states to make it easier to vote. Now, but the lesson from that is pretty obvious. Between now and the next election, things are going to get vicious in a whole lot of states. It's the battle over is voting going to be easier or harder. Now, many of the people who want stronger ID say that, and limits on mail-in ballots are concerned about preventing voter fraud. And obviously, that sounds like a good thing, right? I mean, I'm not going to walk in here and say voter fraud is a good thing. You have to be against voter fraud. But, and it's true in this country that stuffing the ballot box and fraudulent vote counting have been with us since the dawn of time. And there was, in the 1876 presidential election, there was massive evidence of fraud by both parties in different states. But for the most part, the actual voter fraud in this country doesn't happen all that often. So what happened in 2020? Well, let me tell you. Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes. Biden and Trump each won 25 states, but Biden won states with more electoral votes, and so the margin in the Electoral College was pretty big, 306 to 32. Now, immediately after Election Day, supporters of Donald Trump filed more than 60 lawsuits challenging or alleging fraud in the counting in various states. 60 lawsuits. Every one of them has been dismissed, often by judges who were appointed by Republican presidents, and several of them appointed by Trump himself. Only one state judge ruled in Trump's favor on any issue, and it was a minor issue that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court then overruled a few months later. Point is, there is absolutely no evidence that Joe Biden won the 2020 election because of fraud. But if you check the polls, you learn some interesting things. In January 2021, more than 70% of Republicans believed Biden had stolen the election. Okay? It's 2 years later. All of those lawsuits have been dismissed. 63% of Republicans, 63%, nearly two-thirds of Republicans continue to believe the election was stolen. Half of them admit they have no evidence at all. The other half can't identify the evidence, but they're sure it exists. And I find that alarming, but for many of those people, it's perfectly genuine. And because of those genuine fears and genuine belief, we've got battles going on in so many states in which Republican politicians are using the claim of fraud as an excuse to make it harder for people to vote. I mean, think about it. The photo ID requirement, you have to come, I can bring it with me. You have to come in with your driver's license. That sounds pretty fair, pretty neutral. But 15% of Americans don't have a car, American adults, I should say. 25% of Americans, especially in the 18 to 24 bracket, don't have driver's license. If you make someone produce a driver's license, who is that going to eliminate? Well, an awful lot of college students, college students who are probably going to vote Democratic. It's also, should be fairly obvious, that racial and ethnic minorities in this country, the poor people in this country, are less likely to have a car and less likely to have a driver's license. So, is this sinister or not? I guess I leave it to you, but 33 state legislatures have adopted a voter identification requirement, and 32 of them were controlled by the Republican Party when they did it. Is that a coincidence? No, of course not. Now, I've been talking about tricks that people have used to make it harder, if not impossible, for folks to vote. But there are other ways to rig the system. And a common one is when the party with a majority in the state legislature decides to start drawing the boundaries around voting districts in a way that will increase their chances and make it harder for their opponent. States have been playing games with voting districts since the very beginning. In 1812, in Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed a bill drawing new boundaries in Massachusetts. Gerry was loyal to Thomas Jefferson, and the bill was specifically designed to draw boundaries that would make it easier for Jefferson's party to win the next election. One of the Boston newspapers looked at the map and decided one of the new districts looked a whole lot like a salamander. And you've got the feet at the bottom. I mean, this is not any salamander that has walked the earth as far as I know, because you've got wings and pointed teeth at the end there. But the newspaper decided it was not just a salamander. Since Gerry had approved it, it was a gerrymander. Okay, this is where we get the word. It's been bequeathed to history. And this is the best part. I don't know how many of you can read it, but if you look at the map, that district starts in Chelsea, works its way up through Salem and Danvers. There was no Peabody at the time. So it goes through Salem and Danvers, up to Andover, and then makes a sharp right turn to Haverhill, Salisbury. Now, friends, we live in the original gerrymandered district. Okay? We really do. I didn't realize that until I did research for this. But look at the map. There's Danvers right there. That's where we are. You can tell your friends that you have a little bit of political history where you live. Now, are there any ground rules about how a state can draw the boundaries for voting districts? The only real clear rule on the federal side is that the districts for the House of Representatives have to have the same number of residents. The Constitution doesn't say anything about how you draw the lines, so let's think about it for a minute. Suppose we are going to draw boundaries in Massachusetts. Massachusetts gets 9 seats in the House of Representatives. Where should the lines be? You could start with the counties. There are 14 counties, but the county line boundaries don't really help because they don't tell you anything about where people live. Where people live looks more like that. So, oh, I did not do that. Cassie? I don't think I did. Thank you. Okay. The red is where most people live, the green and the yellow less so. And there are computer programs today that could come up with literally an infinite number of maps with that population, breaking it up into 9 congressional districts with the same number of people. That is a mind-numbing job. I wouldn't want that job. My point is, even with the best will in the world, districting is hard. Okay? It's really hard. But of course, there are some people who don't have the best will in the world. But this is what the map currently does look like. There are the 9 districts. You can see that some of them, like the 6th district where we live in Essex County, is pretty compact. But the 1st and the 2nd district stretch all the way across the state because you need, in order to get enough people. Okay. Districting for state elections has been a very controversial subject for a very long time. At the start of the 20th century, most state constitutions said that the voting districts would be redrawn after every census. Every 10 years, we'll redraw the lines based on population. But many, many states in the early and mid-20th century didn't ever redraw their boundaries. So what happens? lines that sort of made sense in 1890, as this nation industrializes, more and more people move to the cities and suburbs, and fewer people live out on the farms, you end up with big imbalances in the size of the district in many states. By the 1960s, some of the imbalances are really astounding. In California, in the early 60s, one state senator represented 6 million people of Los Angeles. Another state senator represented 3 counties in the Sierra Nevada mountains with a total of 14,000 residents. 6 million, 14,000. In Florida, 15% of the population could elect a majority of the state legislature. So, as you can imagine, there was plenty of litigation about arguing that boundaries like that are not fair. And for a long time, the Supreme Court tried to dodge those cases. But once Earl Warren became Chief Justice, he wanted to deal with them and he wanted to do the right thing. And so in a case called Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, the Warren Court held that unequal voting district states are unconstitutional. The case involved Alabama. And I don't know how well you can read the map, but somebody in Jefferson County, where 600,000 people had 1 seat in the state Senate, complained that people, like in another county, 15,000 people had a seat. So, big imbalances, and Earl Warren wrote that the right to vote has got to mean something more than just, hey, I can cast a ballot. It means your vote has to be counted equally with every other vote. As Warren put it in his opinion, it's, a state can't just say the people on this side of the room get 10 votes and the people in that corner get 1 vote. I mean, pretty obvious that can't be right. But the unequal districts do exactly the same thing by giving some people 10 times the political impact of other people. So, the bottom line for the Supreme Court in 1964 was 1 person, 1 vote. Now, today there are more than 70 lawsuits pending in the country challenging a state's redistricting plan. We just had a census a few years ago. So lots of states are redoing their map. And they have to because population moves within 10 years. Now, there are 70 lawsuits claiming that redistricting plans are unfairly diluting the impact of votes by Black people and Hispanic. That's the charge in these lawsuits. And why so many of them? Well, because population has been changing in another way. America keeps getting more diverse, right? Look at the difference just in the white population just from 1970, 50 years later to now. Down from 88% down to 62%. It's projected that in another 20 years, white people will be a minority in this country. The Hispanic population is growing so much, the Black population growing a little, and also the Asian population growing with immigration. With the population balance changing, no wonder that folks in a crowded urban district complain that their votes aren't being counted fairly. And so let's be honest. What's happening in the country is in a lot of states, white people who control the state legislature don't want to lose their power and want to hold on to it as long as they can, and will play with the maps in a way to minimize Black and Hispanic vote. It's sad, but I really think this is what's happening. Now that brings us to the Supreme Court decision 2 weeks ago in a case called Allen v. Milligan. The case involved Alabama's voting district. Alabama has 7 seats in the House of Representatives blacks have a majority in one of the 7 districts. After the last census, the state legislature approved a new map in which blacks still only have a majority in 1 district. But blacks are more than 30% of the population of Alabama. They're concentrated in that yellowish belt, yellow map. If congressional seats in Alabama were assigned on a proportional basis, there would be 2 black representatives. But the current map only has 1 district that's likely to happen because white people in Alabama, 95% of the time, they vote for a white person, not a black person. And about 80% of the time, blacks do the same thing. There just aren't as many of them. Okay, so black citizens challenged the new map because it didn't have 2 black majority districts. The lower federal courts down south actually found a very clear violation of the Voting Rights Act, and they ordered that Alabama can't use its new map. They have to go back to the drawing board and come up with one with 2 black districts. Now, the surprise here is the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the black plaintiffs in that case. To my great astonishment, and probably a lot of other folks, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said, yes, that's right. The current map in Alabama looks like a clear violation. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh, for some reason, crossed over to the liberal side for that case. That case is really quite unusual. And the Supreme Court almost always rejects claims for a state's redistricting plan. And one reason why that happens is that this current Supreme Court really, really hates affirmative and anything that looks like it. Since the 1980s, the conservative majority on the court has pledged its allegiance to the proposition that we have a color-blind Constitution. That's the quote, that's the phrase they use. It comes from an old court decision back in the 19th century. Now, a color-blind Constitution sounds like a wonderful thing, right? Except we don't live in a color-blind country, and we don't have a color-blind Constitution. There's the Supreme Court right there. After the Civil War, the country approved 3 constitutional amendments specifically designed to help the ex-slaves, all of whom were black, obviously. And Congress was given the power to enforce those amendments. Now, the conservatives on the court since the 80s have used the myth that there is a colorblind Constitution to say that government can never distinguish people based on race for any purpose. In other words, whether you're doing it to discriminate against the black minority or adopting an affirmative action plan to help an ethnic or racial minority, for this Supreme Court, it makes no difference. You can't do it. And that means that basically every government program that would be designed to try to help blacks and Hispanic and other ethnic minorities is going to be shot down at the Supreme Court. We've never really had much affirmative action in this country because the Supreme Court stepped in quite early in the 70s. The main exception that I'm aware of is college admissions, right? The Supreme Court has grudgingly said that colleges can consider the race of an applicant along with other factors. There's a case pending, right? The Harvard case is pending at the court. I'll be shocked if they don't say that that's unconstitutional and you can't do it anymore. We'll see. They saved their most exciting case for the last Monday of June, so that would be next week. We'll see what they do. Now, other than the college admissions field, the only other good example of affirmative action in this country that I can think of is Clarence Thomas. Okay? Clarence Thomas is only on the Supreme Court because of the color of his skin. George Bush said he was the most qualified person in the entire country, regardless of race, but that was not true. He was the most conservative black judge that they could find, and he'd been a judge for a year. He's got some interesting ideas. He's written some cool opinions, but he's only there because of affirmative action, which makes it pretty ironic that he is the fiercest opponent of affirmative action in the court. I would hate to be him, honestly, to know that so many people were looking at you and thinking you don't belong here. He dealt with that in college. It must have been terrible. And unfortunately, he deals with it now. So I feel bad, but it's worth pointing out that that's about as far as we've gone with affirmative action in this country. All right, so I'd like to close with a few final remarks about getting too excited, I'm talking too fast. Why voter suppression matters. I mean, obviously, Democrats and Republicans in the states are fighting it out to increase their chances of winning in next election. But I think something more is at stake than just whether a Democrat or a Republican wins. Since the 1960s, since the Civil Rights days, Black people and Hispanic people in this country have had legal equality and they've had the right to vote. What they haven't had is economic equality. The income gap between Blacks and Hispanics and the average white family hasn't changed in 50 years. It's still the case. The average Black family's income is less than 65%. The average white family. For Hispanics, it's around 70. 50 years, and that hasn't gotten any better. If we talk about how much wealth, overall wealth the family has, now what happens? The average Black and Hispanic family's wealth is 20% the average white family. White family, 5 times as much money in the bank. Now, seems, that hasn't, as you can see, that hasn't changed in 50 years either. So I guess where I'm going with this is, if we actually believe that America is the land of opportunity, and if we actually believe that every American should have an equal chance to live a comfortable life for themselves and their family, that's just not acceptable. It's not. But it seems to me, I can guarantee you that if the Supreme Court continues to prevent government programs to help close that gap, and frankly, if white people continue to use districting decisions to minimize the impact of votes by Blacks and Hispanics in this country, if those things keep happening, that gap is never going to change. And personally, that just really seems wrong to me. But you don't have to. Anyway, for what it's worth, that's my view. We're done. Hey, do you have any questions? Thank you all for listening. And yeah.
One thing that you might want to spend a minute or two on is the inequity in voting as it relates to the United States Senate and how difficult it is to get bills through the Senate to the president because of the inequities. For example, California has 2 U.S. senators versus 7 or 8 states in the West who each have 2 senators. The other thing I'd like to make a comment at the beginning, you made a comment about newspapers, CNN, and I really, on the newspaper side of that, we have lost so many newspapers in the country, both small cities and even in large cities, that I think that, frankly, the reason I always subscribe to newspapers is because I'm concerned that they are, within their own limits, they are the one place that you can usually get some real information that we're losing out on now so much national. And sort of the same comment on CNN that, we have some channels that are so totally biased one way or the other. The CNN comes to me a little bit closer, and I probably spend as much time watching political coverage as anybody in this room. And I'm concerned. Well, I served as a party chairman in a different state and on DNC for several years,
Well,
and run some presidential campaigns as well.
Well, all right. First of all, I certainly agree with you on we're lucky to have the newspapers we still have. And I trust my wife on this. My wife, Sarah, is brave enough to read the Globe from cover to cover, and I trust her to tell me if there's something I really, really need to know about. Otherwise, I would only read the sports section, and depending on how the Sox are doing, that's worth it either. But going to the point on the U.S. Senate, when the Supreme Court, when the Earl Warren Court had those state decisions about how state legislature be organized, and the Warren Court wanted to say both state House of Representatives and the state Senate had to have equal population. The defenders of the old system said, well, what about the U.S. Senate? My goodness, no matter how small you are as a state, and the Supreme Court's response was, that was a political compromise necessary in some country, and it's irrelevant. You can either accept that as a good idea or not, but they definitely had to deal with it because it was an obvious inconsistency. But that was the court's answer, and short of another constitutional convention, God knows what would happen there. I think we're still stuck with the U.S. Senate.
Hi. First, I want to thank you for talking. I do have one question on the population count in 2020. There's been some questions as to whether everyone was counted, which then gets into how many representatives every state.
I've read some of those articles too. I mean, first of all, you can't believe they counted everybody, right? There's just too many people, and some of them are hard to find. How many people didn't they count? I think there's some experts really try to work that out and get. But the way the system is set up, the actual census count. But that's beyond my my pay grade, job description, to figure out how to count everybody. But it's a problem. And states with more of a homeless population are likely to have more of an under than other states. But beyond that, I can expect really. Somebody else?
Yeah, coming from California and having been elected to offices in California, I'm a little more optimistic about what the reason for the bicameral legislation is for the purposes of balances in government. And what the Warren Court did in California was to create a unicameral, in other words, one image, two-house legislature. And the effect of that has been an unintended consequence that Los Angeles County now controls totally the legislation in the state of California. And because it contains 25% of the population, and it is within one county. And that county now, because of the media interest within that county, now is probably the most powerful group of legislators throughout the whole country. And how much we respond to the ideas and ideals of California is disproportionate. So I think that we've lost something. What Earl Warren wanted to do was he wanted to get things built in California, and he found that a bicameral legislature got in his way. And he was trying to correct that, but I think it had an unintended consequence, and I think the balance of urban versus rural is the reason we have so much conflict today. I think that the intent of the Congress, when it was put together, that there needs to be a balance between Rhode Island and New York.
I'm sorry,
Was
do you
an
have
honest
is
intent.
there a question? Do you have a question?
I think it was an honest intent. So I would like your feedback as to whether or not you feel or how you see the intent of balance as a bicameral system of government, because you can see it now, not at the state legislature, but the federal legislative process.
Well, I'm about to try to answer the question if I can find the right slide. Almost there. That. Okay. Your comments raise a couple of really important questions, like why do we have the Electoral College? Why do we have a Senate? Now, as I mentioned, one reason that the Founding Fathers wanted a Senate is they wanted a small chamber of really wealthy guys who would make sure the House of Representatives did not go out of control. And that's why they gave them a 6-year term, so they wouldn't be swayed by public pressure coming along. So on one level, we have the U.S. Senate because of that desire to control popular government. But it's also, it goes back to who do we think should make decisions in this country? Because Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million. Should that be it? Is that all we need? Whoever gets the popular vote wins. You could do that, but what I think that means is the East Coast and the West Coast, with a little help from Chicago and maybe Detroit, are going to elect every president. No, is that what we want? I mean, even Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by not as much, but she did. She had her political liabilities, as I think we all know. So, I can't answer this, but this is the basic question. Who do we want to make the decision? The Founding Fathers were afraid that the states with the most people, which back then were Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, that those states would dominate the little one. And so they came up, one reason we have the Electoral College is so that all those little states in the middle aren't totally steamrolled. Right? I mean, on this map, it's a partisan, it happens to favor Democrats to have more people, but it could easily go the other way. And so the question, what kind of country do you want? The Founding Fathers thought geographical balance was a good thing. And when, in a lot of state governments, that was the justification for state senates that represented rural districts that had been together a long time, even if they didn't have as many people. They needed their own clout, because otherwise the cities are going to rule everything. It sounds like Los Angeles. Maybe I don't know that, but maybe that's what's happening in California now. So the thing is, half the time we hate the Electoral College and wonder why the heck do we have it. But you could also ask yourself, would we really be better off without it? Because then it's purely a numbers game. And, I'm not sure I have an opinion, but they're all entitled to yours. Who's got a mic?
Right here. What do you think of artificial intelligence districting states?
Well, I think on one level I'm terrified, but if you actually, I would not recommend this because you would go crazy, but if you were to read that very recent Supreme Court decision 2 weeks ago about Alabama, most of it involves the computer modeling and how many different maps the black plaintiffs and the state of Alabama could come up with. And the answer is an infinite number of maps. You feed enough stuff into artificial intelligence and you will not lack for answers, right? You'll have a whole lot of them. I guess it's a tool, a convenient tool. Some other things we have, computers. But at some point, I guess I think human beings have to decide what to do with all that. I wouldn't leave it. that's a science fiction problem, whether we just turn our society over to the computers and see if they do a better job. Generally, in science fiction, that is not a good idea.
Thank you, Frank. This is a perfect example of why, even though history might make us uncomfortable or whatever, it's terribly important to learn, to absorb these facts about our nation's history. I was going to ask you a slightly different question on AI about the potential for disinformation and misinformation, which I think is going to be very disturbing in the current run-up campaign. But I really wanted to ask you about your thinking about, is it the Moore versus Harper case in North Carolina, where the state legislature is trying to make the case that they would have the right to throw out any election that they found unacceptable without a great deal of any other rationale behind it? Are you aware of that one, or what do you think about that?
That's probably one of those that I missed because I was afraid to read the paper. And that's why I would be afraid. From what I know of the ground rules, a state doesn't have that power. Maybe, well, they can say anything they want. They can say they're unicorns, but it may not be true. So I don't know what their chances are, but I suspect ultimately even a conservative Supreme Court would say a state doesn't have that power. Because then the country falls apart if every state does that. Then the voting doesn't matter anymore. You had another question. Oh, yeah, I mean, obviously that's beyond today's topic, but my kids think that anything they find on the internet is true. Everyone would be wrong if they thought that, because you can't believe the internet and you can't believe everything you read in the paper. You can't believe me. I might be wrong. I'm not trying to lie to you, but I could be mistaken. I mean, what is reality after? I don't know. But truth, we're going to have an ugly time, right? Between now and next November, I would like to hide. I mean, if I was an ostrich, I would be very happy. And the misinformation, the flat out lying about things is getting worse, right? It really is. And, the best example of the big lie, our history, world history, is Nazi Germany, and that's a disturbing analogy, particularly because you had, leading up to Hitler, more and more Germans deciding they didn't trust the democratic process. They were willing to take something else. Boy, did they get something. And obviously, it's beyond today's topic, but I sort of feel like coming a part of the scene. Really. I don't know. I probably won't live long enough. Boots. Okay, another question. I've been yakking up here.
So I just read the Harvard professor's amicus brief in the Harvard case. And their position actually is there was some affirmative action initially after the passage of those amendments. Because those amendments were designed to make black equal to white. It wasn't designed to make everybody equal. And there were a number of laws passed by the very people who passed those amendments who gave blacks preference in education and agricultural loans. And that's, I think, Sandra Jackson's made that point, that if you were an originalist interpreter of the Constitution, affirmative action should be allowed because the originalists in those amendments recognized affirmative action as a way to make black equal to white.
You're totally right about the history, and basically what this tells us is that hypocrisy is alive and well at the Supreme Court. Because, and I'm sure the liberals have their own version of it that I'm less aware of because of my blinders, but the conservative majority on most subjects will say it's whatever the people who wrote the Constitution had in mind, original intent, original meaning. Then when they get to those Reconstruction amendments, not a word, because you're exactly right. Congress followed up those amendments with all kinds of government programs to help the ex-slave. government programs to help black people. That's affirmative action. The current majority on the Supreme Court likes to pretend that's not there. And the fact that they use a double standard doesn't seem to trouble them. Gee, that was an unbiased view of things, wasn't it? Sorry. Anybody else? You don't have a microphone, but you've been trying. So. Oh, here comes one. You're in luck.
I, for one, recognize that there are a lot of errors in the forming of the Constitution, in the interpretation and so forth, but I still think this is a great country.
Right? Because the ideals this country was founded on are pretty great. Hard to think of a country with a better set of political philosophy, political principles. I just sometimes, maybe it's personality, I tend to pay more attention to where we fall short. But would I move anywhere else? Probably not. And I have lived in I wish I could be quite as positive as you are, ma'am, but obviously that is something that each of the people in this room has every right to decide.
One of the things is, where do we go? Why is there so much hate? Why can we not look at one another and just see a person? And we should behave with that person as we would have them do unto us. We've got to get rid of the hate.
Well,
I thank you all for coming.
yes. Thank you all.